My colleague, Father Domenico Arcieri, had not been the same since we were granted access to the Archivum Secretum of the Holy See, that vast and terrible repository of knowledge which the Church has seen fit to sequester from the eyes of the faithful for reasons that until our descent into its lower vaults I had believed to be merely matters of doctrinal sensitivity and the accumulated embarrassment of institutional history. The greatest of theological minds may be unmade by what they find in those lightless corridors where the past does not merely sleep, but breathes with a regularity that suggests it has never fully ceased to be present. My friend Domenico was a man of extraordinary learning, a man whose breadth of scholarship in patristic literature and pre-Nicene theology had brought him to the attention of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at an age younger than any of his predecessors in that distinction. He had published 18 monographs. He spoke 9 languages with fluency and could read 7 more. He had been consulted by 3 popes on matters of theological refinement, and yet the Domenico I knew the precise and careful man who had debated Christological controversy with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a saint, who had laughed at dinner tables in Lecce and Tübingen and Cambridge with the particular laughter of a man entirely at peace with his vocation. That man dissolved in the lamplight of the lower archive like salt in dark water, and what remained in his place was something I would not have recognized had I not witnessed the transformation with my own trembling eyes across the weeks of our shared residency in the city of the Caesars and the Apostles. I am Father Sebastiano Moretti. I write this account not as a confession, though God knows it may serve as one before it serves any other purpose, but as a warning I dare not speak aloud within these walls in this monastery, to which I retreated after what happened, and that I dare not carry in memory alone, for memory, as I have learned at considerable cost, is a vessel that may be emptied by forces older than the institution I have served for 31 years. I am 57 years of age. I have spent my professional life in the study of sacred texts, in the patient and meticulous work of theological scholarship, in the quiet conviction that knowledge pursued with proper humility and proper method is itself a form of devotion and is therefore safe. That conviction has been taken from me. In its place there remains only what I saw beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in the place that does not appear on any architectural survey produced in any century, in the chamber to which only Domenico knew the way, and in the opening that appeared when the door dissolved at his touch and revealed what has been there since before the hill had a name. Let me begin, as my training requires, with what brought us there. The research fellowship that carried us both to Rome had been arranged through the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology, of which Domenico and I were corresponding members since our doctoral years, though our specializations had diverged considerably in the decades that followed. Domenico concentrated on the theological tradition of the earliest Christian communities east of Antioch, tracing the development of Christological formulation through communities whose written legacy was fragmentary and disputed. I had spent my career in the liturgical practices of the pre-Constantinian Church, as evidenced by material culture, the physical objects, the spatial arrangements, the traces that survive in stone and metal and pigment, when the texts have been lost or destroyed or hidden. We complemented each other, or so we had always believed, and the Fellowship offered us access to the Vatican's secret archive at a level of depth that few scholars outside the permanent curatorial staff had ever experienced. We were given keys to reading rooms and index systems that most visiting researchers never approach. We were trusted within limits that seemed at the time entirely reasonable and appropriate to our scholarly credentials and our ecclesiastical standing. It was in the third week of our residency that Domenico found the index. He did not find it in any reading room to which we had been granted authorized access. He found it, he told me, tucked within the binding of a 15th century manuscript on apocalyptic imagery in the Joachimite tradition that he had requested through the official channels pressed between the boards and the end paper, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had placed it there intending it to be found, not by just anyone, but by a person with sufficient scholarly preparation to understand what they were looking at, and sufficient intellectual curiosity to pursue the understanding rather than set it aside. He showed it to me that evening in the apartment we shared near the Via della Conciliazione, in the sitting room that smelled of old books and the particular Roman autumn, while traffic moved on the street below, and the dome of St. Peter's was visible from the window, like a fact that everyone had agreed to stop questioning. I examined it with the instincts of my training, assessing the paper, attempting to date the hand, examining the quality of the ink and the style of the lettering. The paper was old, very old, though in a condition that suggested preservation of an extraordinary and unexplained quality. The hand was small and precise, and utterly unlike any scribal tradition I could place, though elements of it suggested acquaintance with several traditions simultaneously, as though the writer had studied them all and synthesized a private system that borrowed from each without belonging to any. The language defeated me immediately. It was not Latin, though it appropriated Latin characters with the ease of a tongue that has used them for longer than Latin has existed. It was not any variant of Greek or Aramaic or Coptic or Ethiopic or any other language of the early church that I could identify, though it seemed to carry structural elements of each words or roots or grammatical patterns that surfaced momentarily before submerging again into the unfamiliar whole. I have spent 31 years reading ancient texts. I have never been entirely unable to place a written language. This one I could not place at all. Domenico, who read languages with a facility that I had always found slightly miraculous, 11 with fluency, another 8 with scholarly competence, spent 2 full nights with the index before he told me what he believed he had found. He sat across from me at the small dining table, with the document flat before him, and he looked at me over his reading spectacles in the way that he looked when he was about to say something that he knew would encounter resistance, and had already decided to say it anyway. He said it was an index to a collection of documents that did not appear in any official catalogue of the archive's holdings. Documents that had been recorded in this private index under a designation that Domenico translated with some evident hesitation as the lower library. The notations in the index described the document's contents in terms he found extraordinary descriptions that suggested the archive held material relating to theological and cosmological beliefs far older than Christianity, material that had been gathered by the Church over centuries, not in order to study it or preserve it for scholarship, but to contain it, to prevent its circulation, to ensure that what certain very early writers had understood would not be widely known again. I told him this was not entirely surprising. The archive contained thousands of documents that the Church had suppressed for reasons ranging from the doctrinal to the political to the merely inconvenient. The history of institutional knowledge management was not always a proud one. Domenico removed his spectacles and placed them on the table beside the index. He said, "No, Sebastiano, you misunderstand me. The documents were not suppressed because what they contained was considered wrong. They were suppressed because what they contained was considered true, and the truth of what they contained was of a nature that the institutional church, at some very early and very decisive moment in its history, had determined was incompatible with the continued coherence of the faith and the stability of the institution that carried it. I waited. He said the index describes a door, not a metaphorical door, not a theological formulation rendered in architectural language. A physical structure, a feature of the original foundations of the hill on which we sit, that predates the current basilica and predates the basilica of Constantine that stood before it, and predates, according to what the index describes, the establishment of any Christian presence on this hill at all. The index describes this door and indicates that the documents in the lower library describe it in considerable further detail, including its nature, its history, and the nature of what lies beyond it. I asked him what lay beyond it. He smiled. It was not quite the smile I had known across 30 years of friendship and collegial debate and shared meals in faculty rooms. It had the shape of his smile and the placement and the characteristic slight asymmetry. But the warmth that gave his smile its character was diminished or rearranged or replaced by something else, and in the lamplight of that Roman sitting room I noticed this and told myself that I was tired and that the late hour and the strangeness of the document before us were affecting my perception. He said everything the church was built to stand between, everything that preceded the creation of the institution, and that the institution was from its very earliest and most conscious moment designed to address. I should have taken the index from him that evening. I know this now with a clarity that has only increased with time in the way that the significance of a mistake becomes clearer the further you stand from the moment of its making. A man of my training and disposition and 31 years of scholarly experience should have taken the document from his hands and placed it in the hands of a senior archivist the following morning and requested that the matter be examined by the appropriate authorities. I should have declined any further knowledge of its contents. I should have suggested gently but firmly that Domenico himself step back from the document and discuss what he had found with a confessor before proceeding. I did none of these things. I tell myself that scholarly curiosity is not in itself sinful. I tell myself that the desire to know the drive toward understanding that has always characterized the best theological scholarship is consistent with a proper relationship to faith. That Anselm said, faith seeking understanding, not faith fleeing from it, and that Thomas Aquinas held that truth cannot contradict itself, that therefore any genuine truth, wherever it is encountered, belongs to God. I tell myself these things in the hours when sleep does not come, and I have found that they provide progressively less comfort as the months have passed, and I suspect that the progressive diminishment of their comfort is itself a kind of information. Over the following 2 weeks, Domenico worked at the index with the obsessive concentration of a man who has found the question that his entire intellectual life had been without his full awareness oriented toward answering. He stopped attending the daily mass we had observed together since our arrival in Rome, which was the first concrete indicator of a change I had been reluctant to name. He stopped using the reading rooms where our ostensible fellowship research was meant to be conducted, offering to the Institute a sequence of plausible explanations for his absence that I recognized in retrospect as rehearsed. He ate in small quantities at irregular intervals, and slept in fragments, and his conversation, when he engaged in it at all, carried the quality of a man who was simultaneously present in the room and occupied elsewhere, as though the conversation in front of him required only a portion of his attention, and the remainder was directed at something invisible. I watched him change. I observed the changes with the trained attention of a scholar who has spent decades reading evidence carefully, and I told myself with diminishing conviction that what I was observing was the ordinary intensity of a significant scholarly discovery, the particular single-mindedness that serious research sometimes demands, and that Domenico had always been capable of producing when a question had truly seized him. I had seen him like this before at other moments of scholarly breakthrough, and the intensity had always resolved into the measured and communicative precision that was his characteristic mode. But it did not resolve this time. The intensity deepened. The single-mindedness acquired a quality I could not quite name, not merely concentration, but something more possessive, something that suggested the subject of his focus was not merely occupying his attention, but was actively claiming something from him in exchange for what it revealed. He acquired in those weeks a smell. I note this because it seems a small and almost comic detail in a story that tends toward the grand and the terrible, and yet it was among the earliest and most persistent of the indicators that something was genuinely wrong. It was not an unpleasant smell in any conventional sense, not the smell of sickness or neglect or unwashed skin, nothing that would have been remarked upon by an ordinary observer. It was a mineral smell, cold and specific, the smell of stone that has not been touched by light or wind for a very long time, the smell of deep places that have preserved their particular atmosphere across centuries of isolation. I had encountered it before in the crypts of very old churches and in excavations of Roman structures that had been sealed since late antiquity. It was the smell of profound and sustained darkness, and it clung to Domenico in the evenings when he returned late to the apartment, and I could not imagine where he was going that it clung to him so. He began to ask me with increasing frequency and increasing urgency whether I believed not in the abstract doctrines of the faith, not in the theological propositions that both of us had examined from every scholarly angle, but in the realities to which those propositions pointed. Whether I believed in powers and entities and structures of being that the tradition described, but that modern theological scholarship had largely translated over 2 centuries of apologetic accommodation to secular epistemology into metaphor and psychological category and interpretive framework. I told him what was true, that I believed in God, in the reality of good and evil as genuine metaphysical categories, in the creed as more than a set of inherited formulations, that I held the doctrines as real or tried to hold them so with the honest acknowledgement that holding intellectual propositions and inhabiting them experientially were different achievements and that I had more reliable access to the former. He said, "But do you believe in the door, Sebastiano? Do you believe that there exists a point in physical space where what is beyond the ordinary world presses against it, where the membrane between them is thin enough to be opened by the right pressure applied in the right way by the right person? Not as metaphor, not as theological language, as a fact." I said I thought such language was more evocative than precise, and that the tradition used such language because the realities it pointed toward exceeded the precision of ordinary description. He said, "You are a doubter. You have always been a doubter at the core of you under all the scholarship and the ordination and the 30 years of saying you believe. The doubt is what makes you valuable. It is what makes you necessary." I asked him what he meant by necessary. He said, "Come with me tonight, and I will show you something that will answer that question more completely than I can in words." I went. God help me, and I have asked for that help every day since I went. He led me through the Vatican complex after dark, moving through its corridors with a certainty and ease that told me clearly, though I did not allow the implication to settle fully until later, that he had traveled this way many times. He knew the codes for security panels that I had not known he possessed. He knew which passages connected to which and which stairways led downward, and always it was downward, always toward the foundations of the Mons Vaticanus, the ancient hill on which the emperors and then the apostles' successors had placed the architecture of their authority. The descent was long. We passed through official levels. First, the documented subterranean geography of the Vatican complex, the scavi that contain the ancient necropolis beneath the nave, the corridors that archaeologists and historians have mapped and published and incorporated into the architectural record of the site. Domenico moved through these with the ease of thorough familiarity, and I followed him with a growing unease that I am ashamed to say I did not allow to arrest my steps. Beyond the documented levels there was a passage that had no electric lighting and no markings of any kind, nothing that would indicate official awareness of its existence or official designation for any purpose. The walls were cut directly into the bedrock of the hill, and the tool marks on them were not modern, and were not the marks of any period within the historical record of the site's excavation. Domenico lit the lanterns he had brought, 2 of them, one for each of us, and he held his ahead of him and descended without looking back, and I followed because the alternative was to stand alone in the dark in a place I did not know how to leave unassisted. The passage descended at a consistent grade for what I estimated as 200 meters, possibly more, and then opened without warning into a chamber, and I stopped at the threshold of the chamber, because what I encountered when the passage opened was not what the passage had prepared me for. The chamber was large. Its size exceeded what the dimensions of the passage that led to it suggested was physically possible, in the way that underground spaces sometimes seem to contradict the geology. They are cut into, though in this case the contradiction was of a magnitude that went beyond the occasional spatial illusions of underground architecture. The ceiling was vaulted and was made of a stone that was not the volcanic tufa or the limestone of the local geology, but something darker and more uniform, closer in appearance and quality to basalt, though the light of the lanterns was not sufficient for confident identification. It was very old. Everything in that chamber was very old, with an age that expressed itself not as deterioration, but as a quality of presence, as though sufficient age accumulates a kind of substance that younger things do not possess. Along the walls there were shelves of stone, and on the shelves lay manuscripts. I am a man who has spent 31 years in proximity to ancient manuscripts. I know their condition. I know what centuries do to vellum and parchment and papyrus, what light and moisture and atmospheric contamination and the chemistry of the inks themselves accomplish over sufficient time. What lay on those shelves should not have been in the condition it was in. The manuscripts there were by any reasonable estimation of their age, and the estimation forced itself on me immediately, and involuntarily enormously old. Some of them appeared older than anything I had encountered in any archive. And yet they lay on those shelves in a condition that in any ordinary setting would indicate recent production. They were not crumbling. They were not faded. They were not exhibiting any of the decay processes that define ancient documents in conditions of normal preservation. They lay there as though they had been written recently and set down by hands that expected to return for them within days rather than centuries. I would have remained at those shelves for a long time examining what they held, had the center of the chamber not immediately and entirely commanded my attention. In the center of the chamber was the door. I shall attempt to describe it as I first perceived it, with the full awareness that description at this level of intensity tends toward inadequacy, and that the inadequacy is not a failure of language so much as evidence of the limits of the vocabulary available to beings who have spent their lives in the world it leads out of. Stood between 3 and 4 meters in height and approximately 2 meters in width, set into the far wall of the chamber, and it was constructed of a material I could not identify. The material was black and smooth, and it had a relationship to the lamplight that the surrounding stone did not have, where the walls of the chamber absorbed and returned the lantern light in the ordinary way of stone. The door absorbed it without returning it, creating around itself a darkness that was slightly deeper than the surrounding dark. A shadow that was not cast by anything, but was rather a property of the thing itself. Its edges were not flush with the wall. Around 3 sides of the door top and both laterals, but not the base which was set into the floor, there ran a gap, a seam, and from this seam there came something that I am going to describe as light. Though the description is imprecise in ways that matter, it was luminance without warmth, illumination without the quality that distinguishes ordinary light from darkness. It was visible, but what it revealed was only itself, its own presence, its own character, and nothing beyond, as though it came from a source that did not illuminate in the ordinary sense, but simply was, and the being of it was what crossed the threshold of the gap. And there was sound. The sound preceded my awareness of it had been present since we entered the chamber and perhaps since we entered the passage, but my attention had required time to arrive at it because it occupied a frequency range that the mind does not easily foreground. It was felt before it was heard, a vibration in the sternum, a resonance in the inner ear at the low threshold of audibility. When I became consciously aware of it, the awareness was immediate and total in the way that once you have seen a figure hidden in an image, you cannot unsee it. It was a complex and layered sound, many components occupying slightly different frequencies, combining into something that resembled chord structure, without being music in any sense I could identify. It had the quality of intentional sound, not the accidental sound of geological or atmospheric process, but sound produced by something with a reason for producing it. And within the complex and layered whole there were elements that suggested not speech, exactly not language in any form I could parse, but something underneath speech and language, some quality of structured intentionality that speech and language point toward, without exhausting. I stood at the threshold of the chamber and I held my lantern, and I listened to the sound and looked at the door, and I felt with a directness and physicality that bypassed the usual mediating processes of rational analysis that the sound came from behind the door, that it had been coming from behind the door since long before the chamber was built around it, and that it would continue long after everything I knew was gone. Domenico stood before the door. He held his lantern at his side low so that it lit the floor rather than his face. He was looking at the door with an expression I had never in 30 years seen on him. It was not the expression of scholarship or the expression of faith or the expression of wonder or the expression of fear. It was the expression of arrival. He said without turning, "You see it." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you hear it." I said I heard something, yes, something I could not account for. He turned then, and his face in the lamplight was his face, the same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same lines that 61 years of expression had settled into, and also somehow not quite his face, in the way that a room is not quite itself when it is lit from an unusual angle and the shadows fall differently. He said the index describes this chamber. The manuscripts on these shelves describe it, and this door, and what lies beyond it. I have spent weeks reading them, Sebastiano. Weeks of reading documents that should not exist, and that contain things that should not be known, and what they agree upon across every language in which they are written, from every tradition whose scholars sat in this chamber in the centuries that the Church was building itself into the institution we have served, is that the door has a mechanism. It is not a mechanical mechanism. It is a cosmological one. I asked him to explain. He said the door requires witnesses. It requires a specific sequence of conditions to be satisfied before it opens. The first condition is someone who already knows someone who has read the documents and understands what the door is and has crossed the threshold from unknowing to knowing. The second condition is someone who does not yet know someone who has doubted, who has maintained the position of rational skepticism in the face of the extraordinary, and who must be brought to see before the mechanism can be completed. The knowing and the doubting together in this place create the condition the door requires. That is its nature. That is how it has always worked. I said. I am the doubter, he said. You have always been the doubter, Sebastiano. It is the deepest and most consistent thing about you. Your faith is real, but your doubt is real also, and the doubt has always been more foundational, which is why you have never told anyone how consistently it intrudes on the certainty you profess. It is also why you are necessary here. The door requires what you are. I was cold then in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the chamber, though the temperature of the chamber was considerable. I was cold with the particular cold of a man who has understood, several steps too late, the nature of the situation he is in. I said, and the others, Domenico, I have heard you speak of those who came before, of others who stood in this place. What became of them? He was quiet for a moment that was slightly too long. Then he said they chose to pass through. Each of them, in their turn, made the choice that the door offers to those who witness it, fully opened. They are beyond it now, in the place that lies behind it. They did not return because the place beyond does not connect back to this one in any direction that return would take, but they are there and they are not. I believe this, Sebastiano, as fully as I believe anything. They are not suffering. I thought of the workers in the desert, the three who walked out with Jeffrey O'Hare and did not walk back. And I understood that the structure of what was happening here was the same structure repeated across different times and different traditions, the same mechanism wearing different cultural clothing. The doubter brought to see, the choice offered, the passage beyond, and the carrier of the compact continuing. I said, and what are you in this structure? What is your role? He said, I am the one who carries it forward. I have been carrying it forward for longer than our friendship, Sebastiano. I was brought here as you were brought here by someone who came before me, and I saw what you are about to see, and I made the choice to carry the compact rather than pass through, and that choice has a cost and also a gift, and both of them are by now things I have lived with long enough to accept. I asked him what the cost was. He looked at the door for a moment before answering. He said the dissolution of the self is gradual. What you are at the beginning and what you are after, years of carrying it, are not the same thing. The boundary between the one who carries the compact and the compact itself becomes permeable. The knowing incorporates the knower in ways that are difficult to describe from inside the process. I said, you mean you are no longer entirely yourself? He said, I mean I am myself and also something more, and the more has over time become the part that has the stronger claim. It does not hurt. I want you to know that. It does not feel like loss from the inside. From the inside, it feels like expansion. But from outside, I imagine it looks different. I imagine it looks like what you have been watching for the past weeks and have been afraid to name. I have written and rewritten what follows many times in the month since I returned from Rome, and each version has been inadequate in ways that I cannot correct by revision. because the events themselves exceeded the capacity of language to represent them, and revision can only improve language, not expand its fundamental capacity. What I set down here is the most accurate account I am capable of producing, and it is not accurate enough, and I am sorry for that. Domenico placed his hand flat against the surface of the door. Not seeking a handle, the door had no handle, I could see, but pressing his palm against the black material of its face, as though completing a circuit. The gap around the door's edges immediately and perceptibly widened. The sound, which had been at the low threshold of conscious awareness, increased in volume and complexity simultaneously, as though a volume control had been raised while additional instruments were introduced to the composition. The non-light from the gap became more present, more assertive, pressing outward into the chamber's air in a way that was physically perceptible against the skin of my face and hands. And then the door dissolved, not swung, not slid, not opened by any mechanism of hinge or track or pneumatic pressure. It dissolved, beginning at the corners and moving inward toward a center that remained momentarily solid before it too resolved into whatever the dissolution released. The material of the door did not fall. It became very briefly something other than solid, and then it became nothing, and the opening that it had occupied was revealed in its full dimensions, and what lay beyond the opening was not the bedrock continuation of the chamber wall that the physical geography of the site indicated should have been there. What lay beyond was space, not the enclosed bounded space of a room or a passage or any architectural feature. Space in the sense of extent of dimension without visible limit of a volume so large that its far boundaries were not merely distant, but were in principle beyond the reach of any light that might illuminate them. It was dark, but the word dark is wrong is a word from the vocabulary of illuminated spaces applied to something for which that vocabulary was not designed. The darkness of that space was not the absence of light in the way that a dark room is the absence of light. It was the presence of something, a quality of the space itself, a substance or property of the volume that made of darkness something active and characterized, rather than merely the privation of illumination. Within the space at distances that I could not estimate, because nothing within my understanding of scale applied, there were structures. I call them structures because they occupied fixed positions in the space, and had defined shapes because they were arranged in relation to each other in ways that were not random, because the impression they gave was of something placed and designed, rather than something formed by natural process. They were tall, though tall is a word that requires a frame of reference that I did not have available to me. They rose from a floor or surface below them that I could not see into the substance of that space, and they were made of something that caught whatever served as light in that environment and returned it in a way that ordinary materials do not. A cold and exhausted gleam, the gleam of things that have been reflecting whatever passes for light in their environment for so long that the reflection has become a habit rather than a response. Between the structures, things moved. I say things with full awareness of the inadequacy of the word and the absence of a better one. There was motion in the space, and the motion had the quality of animate rather than mechanical movement, self-directed and purposeful, the movement of beings through an environment they inhabit and know. I could not resolve them into shapes I could identify. When they passed through the zones of cold gleam, I could perceive them for moments at a time, and what those moments afforded was impression rather than description, vast, slow, unhurried, in a way that suggested either immense patience or the miscalibration of something so large that what appears slow is actually rapid movement at a scale for which I have no proper gauge. And then there came from the center of that space, from a point that was at first so distant as to be at the very limit of what I could perceive as presence, and that then moved, or the space moved around it, or the relationship between it and where I stood, contracted in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary motion. There came a light, not the non-light of the door's gap. An actual light, though actual, is a word I use carefully and with full awareness of its limitation here. It was cold, not in temperature, but in quality, in the way a blue flame is cold in quality, even when it burns at sufficient heat. It was pale. It was in terms of its color at the very edge of what human visual apparatus is designed to process, and the edge it pressed against was not the warm end of the spectrum. It was enormous in a way that the word enormous does not compass, because enormous implies a relationship to ordinary scale that this did not have. And it had structure, internal structure visible within itself, that suggested without resolving into the structure of an eye. It moved. It moved from wherever it had been to the threshold of the opening, and as it moved, the space around it moved with it, or the space contracted toward the threshold, or some other thing happened that language does not have the precision to describe. And when it reached the threshold, it stopped, and it regarded me. I do not know. I have turned this question over in every available hour for months whether the word regarded is accurate in any technical sense. I know that the light was oriented toward me. I know that whatever capacity for perception it possessed was directed at me specifically, that I was the object of its attention, in a way that was not general or ambient, but precise and specific and individual. I know that in the moments during which it attended to me, I felt the quality of that attention as a physical phenomenon, as a pressure and a penetration and a comprehension that operated at a depth below anything I had previously experienced as being understood. I felt known, entirely and completely and uncomfortably known in all the aspects of myself that I had spent 31 years learning to present well, and the aspects I had spent 31 years not looking at directly. It was in the way of things that simultaneously terrify and clarify, not entirely unpleasant. And the fact that it was not entirely unpleasant was perhaps the most frightening thing I experienced in the chamber beneath St. Peter's. Domenico spoke, and his voice was his, and also not his divided in the way I had perceived his face to be divided, the known surface, and behind it something else, something that had colonized the known surface and operated it from within, with a competence that might have passed for the original for a while to someone less familiar with the original than I was. He spoke in the language of the index, the impossible language that belonged to no tradition and borrowed from all of them. And I understood him as I had understood him in the first moments of our descent, when he had explained the mechanism of the door in the way that dreams produce understanding of languages, that the dreamer does not speak immediately, completely, and without the mediating apparatus of study or acquisition. He said, "I bring you another who has seen and who now believes. As I was given, so I give. As the compact requires, the doubter's witness completes the condition, and the light attended more fully. And in its full attention I felt something that I will call recognition, though I hold the word lightly, knowing it may not be the right one. I felt that whatever the light was, it had encountered me before, had always in some sense known of me, had been aware of me across the distance of whatever interval separated where it was from where I was. I said, "Domenico, the others, the ones who came before me in this place, tell me how many there were." The divided voice told me. I will not put the number here. I will say that it was not small, and that the years it represented were longer than our friendship, longer than his ordained ministry, longer than I had believed he had known about this place. I had been mistaken, in other words, about when the knowing began, about how much of the man I had known had been the man I had known, and how much had been the compact wearing the man's face with gradually increasing confidence. He said, "And now you have seen, and the door being opened, the choice is available, to pass through as the others have passed through into the space beyond and whatever it contains, or to remain and carry the compact forward, as I have carried it until you have found what the compact requires you to find, and then to choose again." I said, "What does carrying it require?" He said, "The compact must be kept active. The door must be witnessed at intervals. The compact itself determines by a doubter who is brought to see. 3 doubters in a generation was the old formula, though the compact is not rigid in this. It requires what it requires, and the carrier in between the witnessing participates increasingly in the nature of what lies beyond. The participation is gradual. It is not painful. It is, as I have said, expansion rather than loss from the inside. But from the outside it will be visible, as your observance of me this past month has given you some idea." I looked at the light in the opening, and I felt the weight of its comprehension, and I thought of every colleague whose character I had assessed, every student whose intellectual habits I had catalogued, every person I had known well enough to know the shape of their doubt, and the quality of their skepticism, and the particular texture of their resistance to the extraordinary. I thought of how naturally in recent weeks that kind of assessment had come to me, and how I had not questioned its origin or its purpose. I said no. The light waited. The structures in the vast dark space maintained their positions and their cold gleam. The moving things between them moved with their patient slowness. Domenico looked at me with the face that was his face, and the eyes that were his eyes, and behind the eyes the other thing, the thing that had moved in and settled, and made itself comfortable over the years I could not now accurately count. I said it again more clearly. I said no. I will not pass through, and I will not carry it forward. I choose neither. He said very quietly, "That is not a choice the compact recognizes." I turned from the door. I walked back across the chamber floor, past the shelves with their impossible manuscripts, toward the opening of the passage. I heard nothing behind me. The sound from beyond the door did not change. The light I could feel through the gap did not change. Whatever was in the space beyond was not disturbed by my departure, or if it was disturbed, it chose not to express that disturbance in any way I could perceive. I found the passage entrance. I began to climb. I climbed for what seemed much longer than the descent had taken, in total darkness, one hand on the wall, the other reaching ahead of me into the dark. I did not hear Domenico follow me. I did not hear anything from below. I climbed until the darkness thinned and the electric lights of the official Vatican complex became visible above me, and I climbed out of the passage and into that light, and I stood there for a long time before I was ready to walk. I left Rome 3 days later. I told the Institute that a family matter required my early return, which was not true but was a lie that occasioned no further inquiry. I went first to my brother's house in Bologna, and then when the quality of my company made me concerned for his peace of mind, to this monastery in the mountains east of Florence, where I have been these past 5 months, where I have written and rewritten this account in the intervals between the prayers that I continue to say, because I do not know what else to do with the habit of 31 years, and because the prayers even now feel like something rather than nothing. I have been informed through colleagues that Father Domenico Arcieri left Rome in the weeks following my departure and has not been located since. His room in the apartment contained all of his personal effects in perfect order, every book, every note, every item of clothing arranged, as though he had simply stepped out and expected to return for them. His journal, the small leather-bound volume he had kept locked, was on the desk. The key was beside it as though placed there for someone to find. I am told the journal was empty, every page white and unmarked. I have tried to think of an ordinary explanation for this, and I cannot. I have filed a written report with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, describing in the most careful and precise language I could produce what I observed in the Vatican archive and below it. The response I received thanked me for my diligence and indicated that all holdings and installations within the Vatican's jurisdiction were appropriately documented and monitored, and that any anomalies I had encountered during my fellowship would be examined by the relevant staff. I believe this response was composed by someone who had not read my report. I do not expect further communication. I dream of the chamber. Not every night now. The frequency has diminished from every night to most nights to less than most nights. And I take this as evidence either that time is accomplishing something, or that something else is accomplishing what it has determined needs accomplishing, and I am unable to say with confidence which of these interpretations is accurate. In the dreams, I am always in the chamber alone. Domenico is not there. The door is closed. The non-light from the gap is present, and the sound is present, and I stand before the door with the understanding that I have been here before and will be here again, and that the door is not going anywhere because the door has never needed to go anywhere and has always simply been there and waited. In some of the dreams, the door asks me something. Not in words, there are no words in these dreams, no language I can recall on waking. But there is communication of a kind, and the communication is a question, or has the shape and the pressure of a question, and the question is about the compact, and whether I understand now, after months of carrying the weight of what I know, that what I called a refusal was not a termination of the compact's relationship to me, but rather a deferral of a choice that the compact intends to offer again. I wake from these dreams in the state that the mystical tradition calls the dark night of the soul, though the mystics who named that state intended something different by it than what I experience in the dark of this monastic cell, and I am not confident that the tradition's remedies for the dark night apply to whatever this is. What I know, what I carry, and cannot set down is a name, the name of what was in the light beyond the door. I know it the way you know something you were taught before you knew you were being taught, the way the body knows things that the conscious mind has never formally articulated. I know the name with a completeness and a certainty that nothing else I have ever learned in 31 years of scholarship approaches, and that certainty, that completeness, is itself an indication of the name's nature and its source, because certainty of that quality does not come from human learning. It comes from a different kind of instruction. It comes from being known by the thing that is named. The tradition says that to know the name of a thing is to have power over it. The tradition is wrong about this, or wrong about the direction of the relationship. To know the name of what is in that space is not to have power over it. It is to be claimed by it. It is to be marked as belonging in some capacity the compact determines to the economy of what lies beyond the door. I carry its name the way a branded animal carries the mark of its ownership, not painfully, not consciously in most moments, but with a permanence that I have come to believe is not going to resolve. In the worst moments, the ones that come in the hours before the early office, when the night is at its fullest, and the prayers are furthest from comfort, I become aware of colleagues. Not through any contact, not through any communication I have intentionally established. I become aware of them with a specificity and a depth that ordinary knowledge of persons does not account for. I become aware of the structure of their doubt, the texture of their skepticism, the quality of their resistance to the extraordinary. I become aware of which of them could be brought to see, and which of them, having been brought, could be trusted to find the chamber and complete the mechanism. When this happens, I do not act on it. I say my prayers. I read my texts. I remind myself of every argument I know for why what the compact offers is not what it claims to be, for why the door is not a door to anything that should be entered or facilitated, for why the correct response to what I know is continued, refusal rather than the gradual accommodation that the compact appears to be designed to produce. Some days the arguments hold better than others. What I have not done, and what I will not do, and what I pray daily for the strength to continue not doing, is to speak the name. The name waits in me with the patience of what gave it to me, which is to say, it waits with patience that does not measure itself in human units of time, and does not experience the passage of human units of time as pressure. It waits. It will wait as long as is necessary. Things that have been waiting since before the hill had a name can afford to wait as long as a man's remaining years, and the patience of the waiting is itself a presence that I have learned to live with, the way you learn to live with a chronic condition, not comfortably, not without awareness, but with the accommodation of someone who has accepted that the condition is real and is not going away. God hears me. I hold to this. I hold to it in the way that a drowning man holds to whatever his hands find, knowing that the holding is not the same as safety, but that releasing is the certain alternative to the uncertain hope that the holding provides. The name waits. The door waits. And somewhere in Rome, in a chamber that does not appear on any architectural survey, the manuscripts on the shelves of the lower library wait in their impossible preservation for the next scholar who will find the index and understand it, and bring another doubter down through the passage and into the light. The compact does not end. That is what Domenico said in the voice that was his and not his in the lamplight of that impossible chamber. And it is the truest and the most terrible thing I know. The compact does not end, and I am in it. This account was found among the papers of Father Sebastiano Moretti, professor of patristic theology at the Pontifical Faculty of Theology of Southern Italy, following his disappearance from the monastery of San Benedetto in Mugello in the autumn of 2003. Father Domenico Arcieri, his colleague and the subject of this account, was last reliably documented in Rome in the spring of 2002. Neither man has been found. The Vatican Secret Archive declined to comment on this document or on the claims it contains. A spokesperson for the Holy See described the document as the work of a scholar who had suffered a mental health crisis and whose claims should be understood in that context. The document was transmitted to the researcher by a member of the archival staff, who requested absolute anonymity, who refused all further contact after the transmission, and who was reported missing by colleagues 6 weeks after the transmission was received. His room contained all of his personal effects. His journal was empty.